All right, so here we are. We're back with Riders of the Dawn, Part 2, Episode 2. This is Stu.
This is Jay.
And I think today we're going to talk about setting, story settings, which is a really broad topic, so maybe we'll talk broadly about it.
Let's talk broadly and then kind of bring it back, because one of the things I would like to talk about more in depth is world building.
Oh yeah, world building, especially as part of like a fantasy setting. That's going to be really, really important to think about. So for me, when I think about setting, I don't just think about place and time. That's that's the way that it's always explained. It's like, oh, it's the place and the time where something is set. But I think of it a little more broadly than that, because what a character experiences as setting is different from just the place and time that they're at. If you think about an everyday life that you go through, or the everyday that you go through of your life, there's people that you meet and people that you don't meet based on your more intimate version of the setting that is whatever modern life is. So you may not spend the day like talking to drug addicts. So if you're writing a story, a drug addict in a modern setting is going to have a different experience of setting than a businessman would have.
Right. And so yesterday we were talking about the movie Heat with Al Pacino and Robert De Niro, where the setting is, a metropolitan city, but how the main characters interact with that setting is as a detective and as a bank robber.
Yeah, as a criminal.
So those, not only does the setting matter, but the character's reality, their lot in life, their emotional mindset affects that setting. Really, it doesn't affect the setting. It affects how they interact.
It affects their perception of reality. So
when I think about setting, I think about a video game engine, for example. So it's the rules in which your story is governed by. So this is like, if you're playing a video game and in this particular engine your character can jump 10 feet in the air, well, that's just part of the game. It's not extraordinary, and all I have to do to learn about that particular part of the engine is play the game. So in a story, depending on what your setting is, things that in reality might seem remarkable are sort of unremarkable or benign in your setting. And this is really true when we're talking about fantasy writing, depending on the setting that you're placing your characters in.
Yeah, fantasy is always going to be interesting, and I think the strength of fantasy. So fantasy, it has two things going for it for setting. First of all, it's an unfamiliar place, an unfamiliar time, with unfamiliar people and unfamiliar rule systems and things like that. So everything's unfamiliar, which makes it possibly inherently interesting on its own. So a lot of people who read fantasy are interested in the setting possibly more than the characters or the story itself. The setting is what is so interesting. Everything that goes into making the set pieces for the world. What's the land look like? You have different geography if you're writing high fantasy. Different geography, different races sometimes. Science fiction's the same thing. Different geography, different limitations. And so I think of it as like when you're doing these more expansive settings, these settings that don't really have anything to do with modern, normal life as you experience it, that creates a completely different set of limitations for the characters and a different set of perceptions for those characters. So what they're going to view as possible and impossible is going to be different from what you yourself experience as possible and impossible, which I think also adds a lot of interest to the story. There's a reason I read a lot of fantasy. And I think it also changes what's possible with the plot. You can get a plot in a fantasy setting that is completely different from what is possible in a normal setting. And the character's perception of reality is therefore also going to be very, very different than what it would be in a normal setting. And I think if you take those things and you have them in mind, I think that makes a fantasy book that much more compelling to a reader.
Well, and we mentioned last time we talked a little bit about Brandon Sanderson, but to take something maybe familiar to the people listening is the Twilight Archive. Wait, is that what it's called? Stormlight Archive. Excuse me.
Stormlight Archive. However many books that'll end up being.
If you haven't read it, spoiler alert. At the end, you realize that the main character, it's like, oh, he's a Knights Radiant. But if that were in a modern setting,
that would make no sense.
It's just nonsense, right?
Yeah, it wouldn't mean anything.
Its setting is what creates the ability to have this specific plot. So this is why when we talk about setting in school, it's terrible. You never actually talk about setting. That's why place and time is like, it's not even scratching the surface. It's like looking at your lotto ticket.
Yeah, it's like, oh well, this story's set in feudal Japan. I'm like, well, feudal Japan has a lot of different geography and different people in it, right? So like, what part of feudal Japan, what year of feudal Japan, and there's so much more. Yeah, it's very limited to think of just like place and time, without thinking about all the things that the characters are going to experience. And I think the three big things that go into a story, these are the things that I really talk about when I criticize books or movies, is setting, characters, plot, because each one of those is derived from the other. The setting determines how the characters are. You're not going to have, a libertarian philosopher in, I don't know, Song Dynasty China. It's really unlikely for you to have that character because his setting is not going to generate the ideas that are going to lead him to be like a libertarian philosopher.
However, if you did, it would be there'd be plenty of conflict with that character.
Yeah, there'd be a lot of conflict, but you'd have to spend a lot of time, trying to explain how this guy came up with these ideas that are, really
antithetical to his setting.
Really antithetical to his setting. So you can do it, but it's kind of hard to do. So the setting determines what characters happen, and then the characters themselves are what determines how the story goes, how the plot itself goes, what events happen, because they're the ones who execute the plot. They're the actors. They're the people who make things happen. So you can't think about plot without taking those other things into consideration.
It's also why sometimes you might think, well, I sat down with a scene in mind and the two characters started interacting and then the result was something different than what I imagined.
Yeah, because those characters are themselves, and if you write honestly, then you can't force your character to take a certain path without rewriting the character sometimes, without making him a different person than who you've designed him to be. But I think that's really important to keep in mind. So setting's a lot more than just characters and plot. Setting is more than place and time. There we go.
Yeah, setting is more than place and time. So how do you determine setting? Is I guess the next good question, which it might be self-explanatory, but where does your story take place? So if you're writing about a group of kids in 1970s America playing baseball, well, you've kind of described your setting in the setup for your story. But then you have to go a little deeper and you have to decide, well, where does this take place? It's more specifically. Then that's going to lead you to more questions about possible character upbringing. If they grew up in San Francisco, 1970s Americana, playing baseball, that's going to be a lot different than if they grew up in Kentucky, 1970s.
Yeah, and and also, how rich are they?
What is their socioeconomic status?
Yeah, what race are they? I know it's like, oh well, race is part of the character. It's like, no, but it determines the setting in a lot of cases too, because if you are, if you're a black baseball player and you live in, I don't know, Houston, Texas in the 1950s, you're going to have a setting that's going to be composed mostly of other black characters because of segregation and Jim Crow laws and those sorts of things. Versus if you had a white baseball player during the same time period, that he's going to experience things differently. He's going to be in a different part of town, so the setting's going to be fundamentally different. You can't ferret these things out quite as much. Why don't we talk about world building? Because we mentioned world building.
Yeah. So this is really important to fantasy, to science fiction. Whether it's high fantasy or whether it's urban fantasy, whether you're taking elements from the real world and splicing it with your fiction world, or whether you're completely creating a world from the ground up. World building is really fun, I think, and time consuming, but let's start with it. So part of world building is setting. So the one thing, how I like to start is, what is interesting about the world? Why do I want to write about a specific world? So in fantasy, a lot of times I think, especially in modern fantasy, the first inclination of the setting might be what makes the people in the setting fantastic. For example, we think about magic systems nowadays, whereas with Tolkien, there was no magic system. Magic was divine. Frankly, it was something. Something God-given, which again is part of world building.
Yeah, the magic, and Tolkien had said this, like what he, what the characters, the main characters are not magical for the most part. The hobbits are not magical creatures; they're just people, right? They're just really little people. What they perceive of as magic is not what the people who are executing the magic perceive of as magic. It's either part of their power or it's part of their technology or art in a sense. Mm-hmm. So the elves, their art is, there's I can't quote the passage exactly, but, there's a part where, like, it's, Sam says something about magic when he's in Lothlorien, and they're like, well, maybe you think it's magic. Mm-hmm. Right? The elf basically says that. Well, yeah, to you it might be considered magic. It'd be kind of like if we went and we met hobbits and picked up our cell phones and started talking to each other, they'd be like, you're magic, right? Yeah. So, sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. That's kind of what Tolkien was thinking. Is like, the elves have this own art that's arcane and not very easy for people to grasp, for men to grasp. And that's kind of what would determine the magic system. Also, I would make a note about Tolkien. Tolkien's magical characters are not the main characters. So Gandalf is the primary, quote, magical character. He's a wizard, right? And his powers, it's not obvious what the limits of his powers are, but we know that there are limits because he dies fighting the Balrog. Mm-hmm. But we also know he's a divine being because he just comes back from the dead.
Yeah.
And to someone who isn't reading carefully, like, why would he come back from the dead? Well, it's because, as Tolkien alludes to, he's been on Middle Earth for like thousands of years. He's an immortal being. He's an angel, basically.
Which is part of your setting. It's part of the engine of your world. When he comes back to life, the reader is shocked. It's like, oh my God, I can't believe Gandalf's back. Shouldn't that be impossible? Even the mortals in the story are shocked. But as Tolkien very eloquently reveals, it's that Gandalf is a divine creature. He's not a man like we think.
Yeah, he's guised as an old man.
Like Aragorn is a man. Gandalf is not. So, especially in a modern, if we parallel Tolkien to modern fantasy, we have the majority of magic wielding protagonists has gone through the roof. We have a lot of our magic users are viewpoint characters.
Yeah.
So we want to know how that magic works, and what ends up happening is that you have to basically make your magic a science.
Yeah, and that's extremely important if you're writing from a viewpoint character's perspective, because the reader has to believe in strong limitations of that character, or they are going to not believe. Like everything's gonna feel like Deus Ex Machina.
Yeah.
If he drops to his knees and he suddenly uses his sorcery to conjure an Archon out of the oblivion, and he comes out and kills everyone. It's like, why did that? How did he do that? It becomes like a surprise, or we just start losing interest after a while when you can just infinitely use. Or it's like, why did he use magic to get out of this situation, but now he's not using it to get out of this situation?
Right.
You get a little confused. So if you go back to the low fantasy or the urban fantasy that people are really going to be familiar with is Harry Potter. Harry Potter starts off not knowing crap and has to learn what he's doing, and his learning is what determines a lot of his limitations. But even then, through the course of that, you start to learn a lot better what the limitations of the other more powerful wizards actually are. Right? You learn sort of, they have this killing spell.
Right. Well,
killing curse or something.
Now I know that this is at this point an old series, but people are going to hate me for this. I haven't actually read the Harry Potter series yet.
Yeah.
So, don't hate me too much. I'm reading it to my son right now. So, I'll get there. It's on the list. It's just when your reading list is piles and piles of books, as some of you may understand, sometimes good works get drowned in the noise.
Yeah. And especially if, Harry Potter is marketed as children's literature. It's difficult to compel an adult to read children's literature for the adult's own sake. So it's not a big deal if you haven't read Harry Potter. But I think one of the reasons people like Harry Potter is that you get this sense of a character growing, and that character has really strong limitations, basically all the way through the series. There's only one weird Deus Ex Machina moment, and then she explains it in an odd way. So where he conjures this patronus charm, and he's like, he didn't know how to do it before that. Mm-hmm. And it had to do with him seeing it and knowing that he could do it ahead of time because of this time travel device that she had in that particular book, in the third book. And that was kind of what broke his spell and made him able to actually conjure this piece of magic that he had a really hard time doing well before that. So it's interesting to think about with that. So here's the thing about world building I also want to say. So we're talking about magic systems. Creating limitations for your characters, I think, is really important, and that's part of setting. I think the other part of world building that I think beginning writers probably focus on too much is there's a sense when you open up a fantasy book and see a map that this world is real and living and breathing, and people want to go first to that,
right?
Instead of thinking about the things that we're talking about, the magic system. That magic system is going to have a much bigger impact than where the mountains are,
right?
So I think my piece of advice for that is try writing a little bit, then you'll have a better idea of what kind of world you really want to build once you're starting to get involved with the story.
And this is something about creation in general that I talk to my students about is you can't, if your goal is to write a story, don't worry about your font. If your goal is to write a story, your first step should not be your concern over the kerning of the text. Or if I was to spread the analogy over to an oil painting, you want to make sure that you understand where all the large shapes are before you worry about each individual grain of paint. I had a student in one of my piano classes yesterday asking me about waveforms because he wants to compose using he likes modern synthesizers. So he's asking me all about waveforms, and I just have to stop him at some point and say, when are you going to start composing? Because right now you're focusing on a grain of sand when what you want to create is a beach.
It's how do I oscillate these two waveforms? How do I get these oscillators to work? And it's just pick a pre-programmed sound and
just
start
go for
writing
it.
music.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, and this is like, you know, you have to create a couple hundred paintings to put on Mom's fridge before you're going to make anything that you want to hang on your office wall.
Yeah.
Or and then a couple thousand after that before anything's going to end up in the Louvre, right?
Yeah.
So your setting is the same way. The more you interact with your setting, the clearer your image of the setting is going to become. So if your first inclination of the setting, as we're talking about world building, is this magic system, or maybe it's just a character and you have this idea of this something that this character can do, well, then there's your starting point. You have to start somewhere. The first step has to begin in some place, and that's as good a place as any to start.
Yeah.
Then move forward from there. You're going to start expanding your idea of this setting as you explore it through your writing, and you as the writer need to explore it in much more detail than your reader does.
Yeah.
So it is true that you're going to be much more familiar with what that world can do and does than your reader will be. Simply because there's going to be things that you understand about the world that your reader just doesn't need to know. But you need to know because it's going to affect characters' decisions in ways that a reader wouldn't think about. You know, it's like, well, if in your mind, in the setting, characters can fly, but flying ends in their inevitable death, for example, like, if a character comes to a cliff and turns around and goes back, that's still part of the setting, and your reader is never going to say, well, why didn't he decide to fly here? Because that's not even an option.
Yeah,
right?
because you've established that's not an option.
Yeah.
And the other thing too is that when it comes to like designing rule systems, anything that's not made clear or explicit, your reader's expectation is going to default to their normal understanding of reality.
Yes.
So unless you basically set it up that like magic exists, if magic happens out of nowhere, the reader might disengage at first, or he might be surprised. But if things happen that you haven't allowed to happen, like, you know, this character just conjures up a fireball and kills someone, you're like, why? How did that happen?
How did that happen?
I didn't know he could do that.
Yeah.
Well, then you've kind of broken that immersion. You've taken the reader out of the story and made him not believe what you're doing. So it's like, yeah, you gotta really think about all those things. And another thing I think about with settings, first you have to think about, you know, what's the culture, what's the society kind of look like that these characters are going to be in, and it's going to create these characters. And you don't have to think about the geography right away, because the geography that matters is the geography that the characters are going to transverse.
Right.
Rather than the geography that has nothing to do with the story. So if you think about like a map of Middle Earth, for instance, there's not really any detail when it comes to what Far Herod looks like, because you never go to Far Herod in any of the stories. There's a lot of detail as to what's going on in the Misty Mountains and the White Mountains, and, you know, in Beleriand and all those places.
Rivendell.
Yeah, there's a lot of detail in that geography, because that's where stories are actually taking place. You don't need to describe Far Herod. You don't need to describe like the Easterlands too much, because you're just never there. You just have to know that there's some people that come from there.
Yeah. And in addition to that, this is talking about your scope as the author when you're world building. It doesn't really matter where you start, just that you start. So it may be that what's cool about your fantasy setting is that the planet that they're on has this crazy tectonic set that makes the world really jagged. The mountains
are really tall.
They're like created the same way sand dunes are created. So that would affect your setting in a big way, because it would change the way that the people who evolved there cultivate their society, and then that's going to just lead you into thinking about that, right?
Yeah.
If the ground underneath you is constantly changing, you're not going to be building houses out of stone and brick, because it takes a lot of work to do that, and at a moment's notice that might go away.
Yeah.
So any point that you decide to start from is a point of growth. It's a lot like, if you think about how we think about knowledge in our world, the more we know, the more we understand about our surrounding. It's like we're widening this spotlight on our surrounding. But what also happens is we're learning all the things that we don't know. It increases our question base. So as the author, what you're doing is you got to start focused, and then you can start expanding, and the questions are going to come to you. And so one thing, if I talk about process really quickly as we're coming to an end, when I'm world building for the first time, I do take some notes to just kind of help guide what I've already thought about. Usually I've written a scene or two already, and I kind of garden that within a character or two characters. I start with a really small setting before you expand out. You don't want to talk about global geopolitics before you understand your setting.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say is about we should probably address this in its own podcast. Is the technical way that you create exposition of your setting. And there's, depending on when you're writing, you're going to see different things, or when what book you're reading from what period, you're going to see different things. It used to be exposition was heavy at the beginning of a book. Now, there's some different techniques that you can use to sort of expose that setting. But what's really popular to do now, and I think is effective, is you write as if the setting is already familiar to the characters, and the characters are going to expose the setting for you as they interact. They're going to let the reader essentially know what's expected and what's normal in that setting, what the limitations are and how they think about it, and they'll what the names of places are going to come from how the characters interact with it. So that's a technical way that people think about setting.
Yeah, I think there's a lot. That's a rich topic that we could definitely spend an entire podcast on.
So, all right, well, I think that's good for today.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening. This is Stu. You can find me at davidvstewart.com, dvspress.com.
This is Jay. You can find me at matthewjwellman.com. And this is Riders of the Dawn.
Yeah, thanks for listening.